which is now. So let's talk about our agenda, as we always do. We move through each of our monthly meetings. We'll talk about bird sightings, identification challenges, committee and other business, a budget vote this time as we're starting off our new year. Some things about our field trips and in the field, open discussions, and then our monthly presentation, which this month is me. And I hope it's a presentation that I haven't talked to you all about in the past, although I've given it to a number of different bird clubs from across the nation, thanks to Zoom. Before we move on, I know we have at least one new member, but are there other new members who are joining us tonight so we can welcome you to the Hampton Roads Bird Club?
Yeah, thank you. I'm Gary Wright. I'm glad to be here.
Great, welcome.
Hi, I'm Caitlin, and I'm happy to have joined. I just joined 2 weeks ago.
Oh, awesome.
And
Anyone else?
I'm June Hartzler, and I'm joining tonight too, and happy to be here.
Great.
And
So
I'm
we have
Twyla Bloom. This is my first time attending.
Okay, cool. We have a lot of people. Anyone else?
Eric Matthews, first timer as well.
Okay. And we met Eric just a little bit before. He's not a cat. So welcome, everyone. I'm glad that we are here, and I'm glad some of our strong members are coming back. I do wish we were meeting in person, but I think you all understand the reasons why that isn't currently possible. So let's excite everyone and talk about what they've been seeing out and about. So who wants to share what they've been seeing over the last couple of weeks, today maybe? Some of us might have some wonderful things going on. Let's make everyone jealous. Who wishes to go first?
Okay. Well, so in our feeder, I don't know about anyone else, but at our suet feeders, we have been getting white-breasted nuthatches. We have been getting Carolina chickadees, of course, and we've been getting red-bellied woodpeckers, and let's see here, we've been getting quite a few. I think we've seen a couple flickers too, northern flickers, and quite a few downy wood, or I don't know if they're the downy. Are they downy woodpeckers?
We're still not certain.
They're either downy woodpeckers or hairy woodpeckers. I don't know how to tell the difference between the two. I'm still kind of learning East Coast birds. I'm from Seattle, so I'm learning East Coast birds. So I don't know the difference. I'm sorry. I'm still learning the difference between those two. And lots of the purple house finches, and what else? Well, earlier we were getting a lot of the goldfinches, but I think they've moved on.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Anything else?
Yeah. Oh, we've
Lot of
been
blue jays and
chasing away a
cardinal.
lot of the grackles. Because they like the grackles, the big grackles, they like, they drain our feeders. We've got 13 feeders in our around our property, so they come and they just like they drain our feeders if we let them, and we don't kind of chase them away. And then the smaller birds don't get the chance to really they don't get the chance to really feed off of the feeders. So if the big swarms of grackles and starlings come and they drain and they empty the feeders, we try and chase them away, but they always kind of circle back. So those guys are always kind of ubiquitous too.
Hey, Sean, in the last week, I've had a couple of migrants starting to come through. American redstart and black and white warbler.
Hi, I commute to Newport News every day, and the other day I saw a pair of terns. They were either sandwich terns or gull-billed terns because their head and beak were both black, but I couldn't be sure.
Anyone else? Okay, sounds like we haven't been birding too much. I was going to throw this up real quick because Downy and Harry's are a little bit difficult. And so I'm sure you've looked in your field guide talking about them and looking at the difference between those. And I just happened to be able to find this while you were sharing about the size of the bill relative to the head. So Downy's kind of look like they don't have much of a bill at all compared to Harry's that have a much larger, more pronounced bill. And there's also some spots on the outer tail feathers of Downy's that are black, and those are lacking within Harry's. But again, if you kind of look like for the bird and it looks like it has a tiny little bill, chances are it's a Downy. And for Harry's, which let me find a better picture, the bill's much more noticeable. And
Okay.
it's going to be something we talk about tonight about what they're doing in the environment. Does anyone else have some tips to share about that are quick and good for helping separate those two species?
Well, the rule of thumb that I usually use, Sean, is if you're in doubt whether it's a hairy or a downy, it's a downy. Because when you see a hairy, the bill is significantly larger. So if you see it and you say, well, I don't know if that bill is big enough, more than likely it's a downy. Because when you see a hairy, you're going to say, now that's a hairy.
Hey, Sean, it's Bill. I'll throw in that Ann and I were kayaking on the Warwick River last month, and I was surprised to see a number of tricolored herons, which I don't normally see around here, but there were several on the river. And I don't know if were migrating through at that point or if that's typical.
Yeah, they're really pretty birds to see. They're one of my favorite wading birds. So lucky you. Okay, well, no others. We'll move on. So over the summertime, my family got to visit Oregon. There was a family wedding. And of course, during the wedding, I did what all good entomologists do, is look for insects and also other invertebrates. So I'm sure there's some wedding pictures with me wandering around with a net and looking for other things. But I also got a chance to bird. And so I thought I would torture some of you, perhaps not familiar with Western seabirds, to try a identification challenge with those. So remember, the birds you are about to see are those from the coast of Oregon. And so let me know what you think each one of these, I think there's just 3 pictures, these 3 pictures are. So I know we have great birders. Don't be shy. I know you all want to ring in. There's no prize.
Rhinoceros auklet.
Right, so we have rhinoceros auklet. Another easy one, maybe.
Is that a dovekie?
So it's I know you can't tell size, but it's a biggish bird. It's rather large. You notice it also has a big, thicker bill, but does have that same counter shading as dovekies do. These are also found on the East Coast up in Maine and New England, if that helps.
Common, go ahead. common mure?
So I think this was a pigeon guillemot.
Oh, pigeon guillemot, yeah.
And then our last one,
Often.
yes. Yep, so this one's a tufted puffin because it has those wonderful little blonde feather plumes over the back of its eyes and head. So a relatively easy bird to recognize, but I got to see him. I wish you were with me so people could have helped find more birds, but we weren't, but that's okay. So I wanted to re-announce some things that we were doing that we started last year that kind of fizzled out towards the end of the year, was this monthly photo contest. And it's for each month, although we'll announce it bi-monthly, so it coincides with the newsletter. And for those months, you can send a photo in to Mike Meyer, who is the publicity, we'll say chair within that committee or board member. And I will help him because he's going to put that together. We'll send it out to the club. We'll make a little Google form so you can vote on your favorite, and the top two will go into the newsletter for each month. And you get to share a little bit about the natural history or how you found them or what you liked about them, just to entice everyone to be a little bit more interactive, because again, we're on this virtual platform, getting a chance for you to show off the cool birds you've seen, or maybe some of your technique when it comes to wildlife photography. So again, for the month of September, I know we're just starting this now, but feel free, take all those pictures, and then right before our meeting, you can, as a deadline, that Tuesday, make sure Mike has those. We'll send those out, the club will vote, and then, hey, we have a September winner. We'll also do the same thing for October into November. So that's a nice way for us to celebrate the things that we're seeing. So I want to invite you to go and do that. So moving on to the committees, Gwen, I know I stole a little bit of your thunder by welcoming the new members, but do you have anything to add or your own welcome to those people?
Just really thank you for coming. I hope you enjoy the meetings. If I ever get to see you in person, I'll give you some more information, and welcome.
Okay, so we're not really worried about hospitality right now because we're not meeting for snacks and such, but Jane and Diane do a great job with that, as well as our summer picnic. And it was nice to see people in the summertime as we were able to install the new board members and some of our other members who attended that nice get together. Remember, we do have a chance to run into each other with the field trips, as well as the Sunday walks. In addition to the Sunday walks, there is also a last Sunday walk, not at Newport News, because the first and third Sunday walks are at Newport News, where we meet behind the ranger station. But the last Sunday of each month is the Nolan Trail walk that will start again this September, October into November, while we're looking for some of those migrants that are moving through the area. So be aware of that. And recently the Bird Club has made some relationships with the Hampton City Library, where we're going to lead a few more walks to some Hampton and maybe nearby sites outside the city of Hampton proper. And there's another opportunity for people to come and bird with us.
The Nolan Trail walk and
Yes.
the hour and the location where to meet.
So we'll meet at Lions Bridge, I think. I asked them for an update about construction, Tom. They hadn't gotten back to me because my point of contact person had left the museum. And then 7 a.m. to keep it consistent with the Sunday walks at Newport News Park.
And the months for that will be
September, October, and we'll evaluate if we want to do it in November, because that might coincide with like Thanksgiving or something like that.
Thank you.
Yep. Anything else since you and I started to chat, Tom, about the newsletter?
Well, I have to thank Dave, James, John, Harry, and Rochelle, and Bill, and Judy Jones of the Williamsburg Club, Diane, and John Adair for writing the newsletter. But the next newsletter will be coming out in early November. And so please get the materials to me for that November newsletter by the 25th of October. Thank you. And please write an article if you would like to. That would be welcome. If you're creative and you want to get something, clever off, please, the club would like to have it for the newsletter. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tom. I know Mike can't be here. Something that Mike was going to bring up, we'll bring up in just a little bit. And then I hadn't seen the Maxis about the webpage, but the webpage is being up to date. They do a great job of coordinating with Tom to make sure everything is up and relevant. But two, if you have some things you want to share or maybe you think should be on the webpage, in particular, something that we get a lot of questions about is wildlife rehabilitators, and we've shared some of that information and contact numbers, but some of those things might need to be updated as time has passed. But check out the webpage. Let us know how that might better serve you. In conjunction with the webpage, there is a Facebook page that is managed. Bill posts a good amount of things. Mike does as well, and occasionally I will post some things too. Oftentimes pictures of our outings or an article about birds or what's the best new feeder or maybe a new book that came out. So that's a nice way to stay interactive with us as well. But one of the great things with this club is our members. So I wanted to just bring up membership and see if John can speak on that point for just a moment.
Finding the mute.
Okay.
We did much better last year than we started. In the end, we wound up with almost as many members as we started the year. Even though we lost about 10 members over the year, we picked up about 10 additional new members. So in the end, our income went well. But this page seemed to be an easy do for most of the members. Most of them use this page as a quick click to renew their dues. And so congratulations to all those who successfully did that. That's about all I got to say about this.
Okay, great. Just as a reminder, you'll notice, and I didn't show all this, this is from our webpage about don't want to print this. There is a form that is on our webpage, so you could fill out a check or something like that, and then a few of the places that you could deliver it to or send to John, the treasurer himself. But again, it seems a lot of us had utilized that PayPal system, or at least the online system there.
Would you look?
I missed the part. What's the total count for the club membership?
Do you recall?
Dave, it's going to come up on another slide. We're going to talk about the budget.
Oh, excuse me.
John, I moved ahead to budget because that other slide in between was just saying, hey, make sure you join as a member.
Okay, perfect. This is the bank balances we had at the end of the year. They're healthier than they were at the end of last year for a couple of reasons. One is we had fewer expenses that you'll see on the next slide. But our primary income, source of income, is the membership dues. So if you think your dues don't count, forget that. They're very important. That's the only source we have or had last year, with the exception of a Christmas auction that we had for some tree ornaments. But your dues are very important. So don't forget during the year. This year, I'm going to try to be more diligent in letting folks know they have paid and then reminding the folks who haven't. I wasn't so good last year, and so a lot of people waited to the last minute, but that's okay as long as they paid during the year. So like I said earlier, for the most part, we did catch up during the year with our dues income. So let's flip to the next slide. And these are our expenses, and they're generally the major ones are about the same year to year. The first four are organizations similar to ours. They're charitable, tax-free organizations, and our charter designates that we make contributions to them. And there are various reasons for each one of them, but you may all be familiar with the VSO, the first one, CVWO, the second one. The Bluebird Society is one that we're close to because we have a Bluebird Trail. We'll talk about that later. And Sandy Bottom is our primary meeting spot. And this is our way of paying back to them for their allowing us to use their conference room. Down in the others, the Educations Fund is one that there's more to say about maybe later, but we could talk a little bit about it now. This year we've located a student who agreed to accept our $500 education fund to support her education studies and field work that she's doing, and I'll let her talk a little bit more about it when she introduces herself in a few minutes. Programs and speakers. Last year we only spent $200, but like this year we're holed up without in-person meetings, and I'm not sure how much we're actually going to need for programs this year. But that's $300 is what we marked. Newsletter, although we put $50 there, we're not mailing or printing many newsletters now. And Tom Charlock has been outstanding in doing that out of his own pocket from home. And as long as that's a very small number, which I hope it is, and he assures me it is, we won't worry about that. But he otherwise should be keeping tabs and sending me a receipt so I can reimburse him. The Bluebird Trail, there are 100 or so boxes in a couple of golf courses over in Newport News, and we maintain those, and the boxes are in need of some repair and paint. I think for the most part we purchased most of the materials, but we put $100 there just in case they need more. The social fund, well, let's hope we need it. That supports the Christmas party we usually have, or holiday party, we call it, around December time, and the end of year June get together where we round up our new officers and cook hot dogs and hamburgers and have a good time in the park. Miscellaneous, that's just in case something comes up we don't have a category for. And the website is one that used to be a higher number. We paid a flat sum a couple of years ago and prevents us from having to pay much this year and next. And the PayPal fees, that's about $30 a year, which is a manageable sum. So in total, I don't know if you remember the previous slide, our estimated income was $1,350. And guess what? Our estimated and a realistic estimate of our expenses is exactly the same. Now, in fact, since we made this out near the end of August, a few more members have joined. So our income next year, as it stands right now, could easily be more than $1,350. But anyway, that's just noise. that's it for the budget. And it's really, we're presenting this to the membership for approval. So, John, I'll leave it up to you how you want to ask for votes.
Okay, so we need to hear a motion for approval. Can I have a motion from membership currently present?
This is Bill. I move that the club approve the budget as presented.
Can we have a second?
This is Angie. I'll second it.
Okay, so if you can unmute and say aye or use the chat to denote your vote. So all those in favor of accepting the Hampton Roads Bird Club 2021-2022 budget, please say aye.
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 Okay, I'm getting some ayes and some thumbs up.
Aye.
Those who are opposed, can you say nay? Hearing none, seeing none, or thumbs down, I will say the motion has carried to approve the budget for the Hampton Roads Bird Club 2020-2022. And Bill, if we need exact numbers, I can give them to you if you remind me towards the end of the evening.
Sean, I mentioned that education fund might deserve some more words. Did you want to introduce Katie Foster or Michael?
So Michael had something, but Katie, you're more than welcome to unmute and just tell us a little bit about what you're doing. I know you promised to talk to us in the springtime, but it would be great if you share with the club some of the things that you're doing, and that way they know where some of that money is going.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so hi, I'm Katie Foster. I'm a senior at Christopher Newport University, and I'm also in the master's program there for environmental science. And my thesis research is on grassland bird conservation in Swope, Virginia, so like near Stanton, Harrisonburg area. And I'm working with Michael Godfrey on his farm to figure out which like cattle methods work the best. So like rotational grazing versus continuous grazing, and what time periods the birds are breeding so that we can make hay at times when they're like least expected to get run over by the haymaking machines.
Okay, great. So just out of curiosity, how is that going?
Good. I started my research over the summer, so I have data from then, and then I plan to do it again this upcoming summer. I had some problems finding the grasshopper sparrow nests and the Savannah sparrow nest because they're like right on the ground, but I found a lot of red-winged blackbird nests, so I'm considering turning my thesis just into red-winged blackbird conservation, but I have to talk to my thesis advisors still about that.
Yep, no, that's understandable. Sometimes you want to do something, you end up discovering you can't. So
yeah,
we're excited to hear from you in the springtime, sharing what you've been doing so far and getting more details about your project. So we hope a little bit of money helps you out in your future endeavors.
Absolutely. I'm so grateful. Thank you guys.
On behalf of the club, you're very, very welcome. Okay, moving on about our field trip. I think these are the correct details because I stole them from the website. This weekend, the plan is to go to Hog Island, WMA. I know there is a fee to enter WMAs if you don't have a fishing license or the license that is used for WMAs. Someone might be able to correct me about how much that is. One of the big things with the WMA, because it passes through Dominion Energy Surrey power plant, is that there needs to be ID. So you need to have your ID because there is a security check. And my understanding is they're going to meet at 7 a.m. at the entrance gate before entering into the WMA. And again, this weekend. Does someone want to follow that? I don't know if James is here or Mark.
John here.
Okay.
I communicated by email with the one of the people that work there at the power station, and they're the ones who inspect the vehicles and allow us to come in. The Hog Island itself is a MWR, and MWR, just as a policy, requires a $4 entrance fee unless you have one of the many items that qualify as a free pass. But there's no one there manned to collect that money. So that's never even come up with people that visit. They really do accept a lot of different things that you might already have, like fishing licenses, hunting, national park passes. I'm not sure what else there is, but I mentioned it last time we went there last year as I was signing in, offering to show a guy, the guy that signed us in, any of those passes, and he kind of scoffed at me. Of course, this was during the COVID there too, so maybe I think they've changed policies during COVID time. It could be a money exchange they don't want to do, but at any rate, I don't think there's a requirement to pay, but you might want to have a few dollars in hand just in case.
Okay, great. Thank you, John, for those insights. Some final details about that trip relate a little bit to social distancing. Just be a little bit careful. I know oftentimes we like to carpool, but again, as some of you might recall, my doctoral work while I do study ants was actually in pathobiology, and I've been keeping track of things, looking at studies and stuff, and it seems like some of those variants are problematic. And we all might have some elderly people or some young people in our lives. And this is just a friendly reminder, because we've all adapted to that now, but don't be complacent and continue to use masks and social distancing and not high-fiving everyone when you see a bird and do things like that. So just be aware of that. And then also put on your calendars for October, the Eastern Shore trip, which should be wonderful for looking at migrants and having a good time seeing some of the bird life out on the Eastern Shore. So be aware of that in October so you can plan. Related to COVID was an idea that we had related to club masks. And I know Mike isn't here, but I think one of our board members is on that helped Mike out in this. Is Katrina here that could speak on this for just a moment?
Yes, I'm here. So we were looking into ordering some personalized masks, and the idea was kind of twofold. One, we could sell them to members, so anyone that was interested could buy one, and then we could also use them to gift to speakers in place of kind of an honorarium. We could send those. And then there was also some talk about potentially giving them to community members sort of as an incentive to try to get people to attend events. So this is just a quick rough markup that I did. They work out to be approximately $12 a mask at the end. So that is what we would resell them for. So it's not to make a profit or anything, just to sell them at cost. There's other colors and we can change the placement of the logo, but we just kind of wanted to present that and get some feedback about how everyone felt about it.
So in the interest of time, if you would send Katrina or Mike your thoughts, if you thought maybe a different color, a different placement, if you are in fact interested in purchasing some, please share those details so we have a better count and plan in ordering those. But I'm going to move on from that just because I've noticed how late it is and the speaker wants to get to his presentation. Before that, though, Dave, do you want to speak about the Big Virginia Birding Day? Because that will occur before our next meeting.
Sure. For those who maybe are new to the club, we did this last fall as a way to kind of get everybody working together since we were in a lockdown situation. But we decided we were going to do a Big Virginia Birding Day. And so this fall, it's going to be October 9th, Saturday. And you can bird anywhere in Virginia. And just go out and identify all the species you can. We don't need to know the numbers of, say, numbers of blue jays you see, just the fact that you saw a blue jay. And you can bird as little or as much as you want. You can do your backyard, a park. You can go up into the Blue Ridge. So anywhere in Virginia. And when you're done birding, send your list to me and we'll compile it and see how many birds we as a club can come up with on the birding day. Last fall, we had 138 species. So if anybody has any questions, just shoot them my way and I'll answer them for you.
Great. Thank you, Dave. And so hopefully that's something that's being looked for because it was a fun day. I think a lot of people had a great time, and that's why Dave decided to organize it once again. Dave, I cut you off. I apologize. What were you going to say?
That's all right. I was just going to mention as another opportunity to go out birding, you'll see in the newsletter, they talk about the Kip to Peak Challenge, and that is the 25th of September. So it's coming up, another Saturday. And it's a Coastal Virginia Wildlife Observatory effort. And there are several members in our club that are already involved with that. Mark Sopko's on a team, Harry and Rochelle Coldstock are on a team, and I have a team. So if anybody is interested in birding during the Kip to Peak Challenge, you can see the contact information in the newsletter, or again, shoot me a note. And there's lots of opportunities where you can bird, whether it's a 24-hour, a 3-hour, a special venue. So you can just pick like a park or something. And if anybody has young kids or grandkids and you want to enter them as a youth team, 18 and under, we also have a category for that. So, and that birding takes place anywhere from east of I-95. So basically the coastal plains of Virginia. So again, if somebody interested in putting together a team, shoot me a note on that too.
And Dave, they can also sponsor a team if they like, right?
That's true. On the website, the teams are listed with you just click on the team and you can actually sponsor that team, throw some dollars on it. It's a fundraiser for CVWO, or it's our annual fundraiser. So, yep, that's another way to do it. Thanks, John.
Great. Anything else? Because those are really good things to get us out birding and a really good organization to participate and help raise some money. Okay, hearing none.
Sean, it's Bill. I just always like to throw out there as early as possible that the Christmas bird count will be on December 18th this year. There's an article in the newsletter about it, and I will be soliciting for participants very shortly by email.
Okay, great. Yes, Christmas bird count. Start thinking about it because it's an important tradition to continue. Thank you, Bill. I'm sorry I didn't have a slide about it. Maybe because I just started school and I can't even think of that far ahead. But
well, I didn't send you one either.
Well, all good. So let's welcome our speaker for the evening. Our speaker tonight is myself. Some of you might be aware that this is my 6th year here in Hampton. I just started my 6th year at Hampton University. Some of you might also be aware I was recently promoted to associate professor at Hampton University, and I'm one of the few organismal biologists there, involving students in research about bugs and insects, and of course, birds, in particular bird behavior, because that's something that's typically easy to observe for some of our common species. And I've been asked frequently to mix my two passions. I really like birds. I wanted to be an ornithologist when I was young. I originally went to the University of Delaware to study birds, started doing research related to birds, but getting up early, being a freshman, wasn't conducive for my grades. I actually switched to mating behavior within cucumber beetles with Doug Talamay, but I still held on this passion for birds that I started young, probably around 12, really got into it when I was 16, but I also really like insects. And so tonight I want to talk about the melding of those two because they're interrelated together. And as I like to do with our talks is to get you in the mood. And so I'm going to have a few pictures of birds, a few pictures of insects, and I want you to think about relationships. I want you to consider, how would a bird be related to an insect? How would an insect be related to a bird? And I want you to think ecologically about those connections, perhaps, about those relationships. So starting off, this is image 1. And I'll kind of just slowly go through to guide you in that meditation. Image 2, a small group of web spinning caterpillars filling their home with little particles of poop. But maybe out in the distance, we see another bird. So image 3, four, five, six, seven, 8, nice little random group of sanderlings. 9, a little parabola of sanderlings. 10, and that will end our little journey through some insect and bird images. And I hope as we thought about those relationships, we realized that insects and birds seem quite different, but on some fundamental layer, some fundamental foundation, birds and insects are going to have intimate relationships. And one thing that we can pull from that is that around 80 to 92% of North American birds are going to rely on insects at some part in their life cycle. The numbers vary depending upon the resources you look at, but a lot of birds are going to rely on insects at some stage in their life, the birds as well as the insects. And equally, insects are going to rely on birds. And what I hope to do tonight is talk about that juxtaposition of birds relying on insects, but also insects relying on birds. And here we have a little skipper that's sucking up some little salts and high nitrogenous waste found in a bit of bird poop. So what I hope at the end of the evening you'll be able to do is look at some of the roles insects play. And when you look outside, think more ecological. And it's just not a bird, it's just not an insect, but there is a relationship between birds and the environment and between insects and the environment. And typically when we think about that at a fundamental introduction of a bird to an insect, I think we could all list some of those relationships. Of course, insects are going to be prey for birds. Equally, insects are going to be disease vectors that are going to play a role in population control birds, but also making birds sick. and we can talk about that and shall talk about that. Even at times, some predators might come from insects to feed on birds. And equally, both birds and insects have ecosystem impacts. And we'll talk about some of the ways insects actually change the community around them that directly harm or enhance birds and their biodiversity and their survivorship. How many birds are out there in a population? So one of the things that we will do, because I'm biased towards insects, of course, we're talking about it through the lens of birds as well, is to think about what insects do. And for a lot of people, we understand that insects are playing an important role as pollinators, because that kind of gets drilled into us over and over between television, from learning and being experienced. But I want you to recognize that insects fill a lot of different roles within the ecosystem. And insects have the highest diversity of all organisms that are not bacteria. So if you look at mammals, you look at birds, you look at frogs, you look at plants, you look at algae, there's more insects and more arthropods than any of those groups. And some really important things that they do is play a role in decomposition. As I mentioned, pollinators, also being major prey for a lot of different things, not just birds, and also being major predators on other insects and on other arthropods, and sometimes being predators on things like snakes and things that you wouldn't think an invertebrate's eating, but here they are eating this snake or eating this frog or eating this lizard. So one way to think about the roles that the insects play is to do D2P3. That's just an organization of diversity, decomposition, pollinators, prey, and predators. Now, one of the things that we can talk about, especially if we were talking to people who aren't really nature people, I know I am preaching to my choir, but oftentimes people want to know, why is a mosquito good? Why is a caterpillar good? Why is a bumblebee good? And I get these questions all the time, just not from my students, but when I go out and do talks to the public, or someone finds out I'm an entomologist. And one way to talk about that is a universal point of understanding, is about services. Or if we had to pay something to do that job for us. And so as a whole, insects provide about 60 billion ecological dollars services to the environment around us. A lot of it is their prey items for birds and bats and amphibians, and equally those prey items and that predator is going to be important for us, right? More fish, well, that's good for fishermen, especially if you're a trout fisherman. That brings a lot of money into local communities through fly shops, through fly guides, hotel rentals for people to go fish. And of course, for trout, it's really a lot of times dependent upon insects. And you tie the various bits of bait that mimics those flies, mimicking insects. But also insects do a really important job, as I mentioned, in pollination, but also industry, such as silk, at least formerly silk, decomposition, which I mentioned, pest control by being predators, keeping other pest insects in check, and then biomimicry. And that's where we might be looking towards nature for inspiration for engineering projects. And maybe another arrow that I could have put up there is pharmaceuticals. There's a lot of money that's going into a field known as bioprospecting, and that is looking at animals and looking for plants for compounds that can be used by pharmaceutical companies to help with pain, help with headaches, help with digestive issues, and utilize what those insects are making for that. But to get back to our smaller story, we can think about these relationships. In particular, one that comes to mind between birds and insects is this predator-prey relationships. The most obvious, is the one we observe the most easy. But I really want to drive home the point that if we look at insects and we look at birds as a whole prey item, it has been a strong influence on the evolution, the ecology, the behavior of the birds that we see around us. And if you read any bird book, you go out with anyone, if you're searching for birds, where's the best place to look for a certain bird, you might come across this idea of a niche, which I'll take a moment to define on the next slide. But remember, the underlining point that I'm trying to make is niches are a result of adaptations. And one big thing that all creatures need to do is to eat. And so insects being that prey item is driving the evolution and hence the niches that we find for birds. Now, the rather formal and complex sounding definition for a niche is the n-dimensional hypervolume. And what that simply means is it's more than just where a bird lives. It's more than just the role the bird plays. It's multifaceted. And it includes things like temperature and diet and seasonality, the ability to migrate, the elevation, the smaller habitat. So yeah, it lives in a forest, but it lives in a oak maple forest opposed to a tupelo pine forest. And all these various dimensions that a bird has to live through, or insect has to live through, shapes the niche that it is found in. And so we have this idea about it being an amorphous, multi-dimensional component when we talk about all those ideas, such as disease and distribution. And in particular, competition and competition for food. We've all experienced how bird competition for mates has driven bird songs, bird plumage, bird nesting habits, but competition has also driven the behavior as well as the gross morphology of birds. And it's done that because competition's hard. You can only really exist within a sphere of a niche if you are able to etch out a little portion of that just for yourself. And this is an idea known as niche partitioning, where if we were competing for the same exact resources, one of the two of us are going to be better. So if we can imagine we have to chase down something to eat, Dave is probably a lot better at chasing something down than myself. So while we have a limited food resource, Dave might exploit it by being a fast runner to get that food resource, where I'm more of a sit and wait ambush predator. Food comes by, then I grab it. But we can see resulting from that is this idea of overall shape of our birds being different. So I've picked some different pictures of various shorebirds. And what I hope you see by looking at these various shorebirds is that they have different size and different shape bills. And that allows them to reduce competition, such as wimbles being able to eat deep into the mudflats, where some plovers can only feed at the surface, or maybe slightly down into the mud or into the sand. So we can occupy the same physical space, but not compete for the same food resources. And while we occupy the same physical space and not competing for the same food resources, we can increase overall diversity within habitats. And birds do this. This was a discovery by a scientist by the name of MacArthur that looked at warblers in Canada and what they were utilizing within a single tree. And these examples are showing where they were feeding, the various heights at which these birds were feeding, as well as where. Not just that they were high, but they were feeding out on the branches or they were feeding close to the trunk. So all these different birds feeding on insects were able to do so by doing it at different points in the structure of that tree. Because after all, when we think about a bird out on your grass, you look out your window, you see something like a mockingbird, you have to remember that what you're looking at is a little dinosaur. And those creatures that we think about seeing every day are these great predators that have been going on for millennia, searching for their prey items. And they are subject to the complexity of that food chain that they live. That is, we know that plants are going to provide the start of that food chain. But insects are often this intersection between plants and the rest of the food chain, especially when it involves a lot of the vertebrates in here in the eastern part of the United States. So a lot of mammals, a lot of reptiles, a lot of fish, a lot of amphibians, birds, they're all starting off feeding on insects. And so, of course, with insects, we get more birds. And from birds, as we have seen in slides in the past, because I like it, we get bigger birds that are able to inhabit those various ecosystems. And again, just to drive this point home, is that insects sit at this nice intersection that are helping to regulate or impact plant communities, and then also regulate and impact bird communities, increasing potentially or decreasing diversity of plants and birds. And one way that you can think about that locally is an idea of just an oak forest. So that picture of the oak trees was taken at Newport News Park. And of course, oaks make acorns, and yes, small mammals will feed on acorns. Snakes will eat those small mammals, and you have birds that will eat the snake, like red-shouldered hawks, for example. But you also have a lot of insects feeding on the acorns, feeding on the foliage, feeding on the wood of a tree living as well as a dead tree. All of those provide resources for other insects or spiders and birds like gnatcatchers. And of course, gnatcatchers and warblers are going to be prey items for birds like Coopers and sharp-shinned hawks. So we can see just through these two diagrams that insects often mediate a diversity within the systems that they are. That is, with insects, we have more birds. And so some of us might be familiar with Doug Talamay's work. So this first bit with the Carolina chickadee was done from Doug Talamay. He writes about it in his book, Bringing Nature Home. That next one with the black-capped chickadee, I had students do previously, looking at a few different studies, and all the studies weren't done in the same place. So the demands of a bird living in Maine are going to be different than a bird living in, say, Georgia for thermal regulation and having enough calories and metabolism to grow. But roughly what I want us to take away from that, being pulled from the literature, although not equalized or arranged because of location, is that both of these, Carolina chickadees and these black-capped chickadees, eat a lot of caterpillars, especially in that breeding season. And without those caterpillars, you can't host those birds in any location. And so even when we go out and look for the birds that we might have in our yard, and birds that we might not think about being insect feeders, maybe feeding on suet like this downy woodpecker, is this idea that insects are controlling the population of birds that you see in your yard, or see when we're on a field trip, or see in the cityscape. Insects are going to be the root of bird diversity. So let's talk about some different examples for a little bit and see if I can give you some fun facts to share with friends, neighbors, a complete stranger. Yell out next time you see someone some interesting things about birds and insects. So some of us might be familiar with a group of birds known as the pitahus. This is a group of birds found in Southeast Asia, and they are the only example of, well, there's another example, but one of the few examples of birds that are poisonous. Recall there's a difference between poisonous and venomous. If it bites you and you die, it's venomous. If you bite it and you die, it's poisonous. And so the way these birds were actually discovered was through a scientist, and he's pictured there, who was retrieving them from mist nets. So one of the ways that you can collect birds is you have a netting, and that netting is very, very thin. It's hard for the birds to see, and it's called a mist net because it just kind of blends into the background like a fine mist. The birds hit the net and they tumble into a little pocket, and they can be carefully retrieved. However, the bird doesn't like this, so they peck and they scratch. And the scientist licked the blood, sucked the blood from some of those birds scratching, and his face started to swell up. And it's because these birds have a batrinotoxin. Now, that batrinotoxin is the same toxin, and that's where it gets its name, as the poison dart frogs of Central and South America. Now, like the poison dart frogs in Central and South America, it's not the frog that's making that toxin. It's not the bird that's making its toxin, but its diet. The frogs feed on ants and some other insects that have toxins and venoms. They keep them and become poisonous. The bird eats some beetles that makes toxins and then secretes them and are found on the wings. So when you eat the bird, you get those toxins. So here's an example of a really complex relationship. The diet of these birds are conveying some level of protection to those birds because they're eating poisonous insects and using that for their protection. And of course, other behaviors that we might be familiar with are things like hawking and gleaning. So hawking, where we might have flycatchers that are sitting proud and high in a tall tree, on a wire, on a fence post, waiting for an insect to fly by, and they go out and grab it. Or they might be foraging, just trying to pick off little tiny insects, little tiny caterpillars from the edges of foliage. And you see this often with kinglets, especially in the wintertime, because there are some insects that are out and active, where they're flying around the tips of evergreen trees or around the tips of holly trees, looking for these insects to feed on. In fact, sometimes it is pushed these behaviors known as flush pursuit foragers, such as the American redstart that Dave noted that he had seen migrating through, or another redstart species, the slate-throated redstart that lives out in the western part of the US, that as they forage up in the trees, they open their tail feathers. And this flash of light or this contrast of color is start to startle insects. And so as the insects get startled, that's when the bird can pick them up. They can sense that movement and they're able to feed on those insects. Another example that some of us might love locally is the yellow-billed cuckoo that loves caterpillars, loves caterpillars. And in the spring and in the fall, you can see them hanging out by these webworms, these web-spinning caterpillars, and just eating as many caterpillars as they possibly can. And I've looked at different studies, and some are giving estimates of 100 or more caterpillars within a certain number of time. And I think I saw one that someone calculated like 25,000 caterpillars in a day. So that's a huge impact that those caterpillars are having by giving those resources. And of course, the success of yellow-billed cuckoos being related to the caterpillars. Another bird that we can mention that has an interesting feeding behavior are known as the bee eaters. So where they actually go after insects that are known to sting. And you can find these in Africa and Asia. They're across those parts of the world, the Middle East as well. And they will pick up bees and then smush the bee a little bit and then rub the bee's butt on a piece of branch, which makes all the venom kind of leak out, or the stinger gets stuck and gets pulled out, and then that bird can eat on its own. Another example, and again, I was just kind of building this theme with different examples of birds and insects prey, is with cicadas. And so cicadas are going to be a great dietary item for many birds because they're a hefty insect. Around our area, cicadas are big. So I threw a non-insect species up here. This is a copperhead photograph that I found. So we often think about copperheads being these predators going out, chasing down mice, looking for things like that. But here they are being opportunistic to feed on those cicadas, and a praying mantis, of course, eating that cicada. And you even have birds that you typically think maybe eating seeds that are out and about feeding on cicadas. And I know this last year, there was a lot of concern about brood X throughout most of the mid-Atlantic region, having an impact on birds, because one idea for a lot of this bird disease that spread in the mid-Atlantic was the idea of it being related to the brood X for two reasons. One, people being concerned about that tree, so they sprayed a lot of pesticide. The birds ate the cicadas and got dosed with pesticide. The cicadas also have a fungus that lives in them. So some were speculating that that fungus was causing a problem with the birds as well. I don't know if there's any support for that. I know Cornell's disease laboratory ruled out a lot of potential pathogens that could have impacted those birds, although Audubon Society and Cornell says that even though a lot of the birds were becoming sick, we were advised to take down our feeders, that it didn't really impact bird populations too heavily. And I haven't done the research to see if a similar problem occurred last time the cicadas came out, because you think, well, if it happened last time, maybe that might be the actual causality for that. Also, with fungi, sometimes they're specific to their host. So if they're just affecting the cicadas, they shouldn't affect birds, but fungi also make a lot of chemicals, so that could be impacting the bird population as well. And population densities and contact is really what drives disease spread. And that's why it was advised to take your feeders down, because if birds are coming to the same feeding station, they can pass those pathogens around. So on some level, it was a way to socially distance the birds so they weren't spreading a potential virus or spreading a bacteria or spreading a fungi amongst themselves. So just as a little idea, because we can put our feeders back up, but make sure you do wash your feeders and you take and clean them and have a lot of feeders and spread them out in your area so all the birds visiting aren't pushed in one centralized location. I know there's a lot of bird polls out there that it's a nice viewing platform, but by having everyone in one place, you do increase two things: the potential for disease spread, and also makes it easier for predators. Although I don't mind when a Cooper's disruption comes through the neighborhood, because I'm still feeding birds just at that next part of the food web. Now, a lot of birds that we might see, as I've mentioned, feed on insects, and a lot of them feed on ants, which breaks my heart, because you all know that I love ants. And I also love birds, so I'm kind of torn between that. But oftentimes these insects play really important roles in the survivorship of birds. In particular, if we look at this bird here, which is a red cockaded woodpecker, a lot of its diet in longleaf pine savannas of the southeastern United States is heavily dependent upon the ants that inhabit those areas. They feed on a lot of insects, and some of you may remember a speaker in the past talking about all the insects that red cockaded woodpeckers feed on. But a lot of studies in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Florida do denote that they are proportionally, ants are making up a lot of that insect diet. And sometimes, not as a dietary item, but ants are playing a role in bird health, being observed with this behavior known as anting, where birds go and find an ant colony, they lay down and kind of disturb the ants, and the ants come up and cover the bird because they don't want anyone bothering their nest. And it's not completely understood why this behavior exists. There's a lot of ideas, but there's not a lot of evidence to say one way or the other, or is it a combination? Some think it's the ants are coming up and they're actually picking off lice or mites that are associated with the feathers. So they're physically going about removing some of those ectoparasites. Others have noted that a number of ant species are chemical factories and they secrete things. And in this image that I stole from online with some formica ants, they're a common ant, you probably have them around your house. Sometimes they're referred to as piss ants because they can spray a stream of formic acid. And some people have suggested that dousing of the bird's body with those compounds are like an insecticide, and they get rid of the mites and get rid of the lice that are living within the feathers of that bird. Now, just one or two more examples about the intersection of birds and their behavior and feeding on insects. We can see with cattle egrets as they follow cows and horses and other livestock, as well as lawnmowers that go through the fields and disturb those insects like grasshoppers. They make it easier for those egrets to pick those prey items off. So I want us, as you start to explore the world, really don't think about simply identifying that bird, but think about identifying its behavior. Why is it following that horse? Why is it just in those grasses? Why aren't these cattle egret down in the salt flats like I see so many other egrets and herons? And really start to tease apart and appreciate the diversity of behavior and ecology and natural history that we can see. Now, some birds feed on insects that we might not think feed on insects, in particular, the hummingbird, because hummingbirds, we classically think about feeding on nectar from flowers or provided artificially. But when they are breeding and they have babies to take care of, they're going to rely on the protein from those insects to supplement feeding on their baby. So they really need a lot of arthropods, and they uptake more arthropods during that breeding season than they typically do when they're out and about on their own. Of course, the tables can get turned, especially with small birds like hummingbirds. And I'll forewarn you, some may be disturbed by the next series of photographs, because sometimes those hummingbirds became prey items for insects or insect relatives like this garden spider, where you have the hummingbirds falling prey to what previously has been a prey item. So switch the tables up, especially with praying mantis, and some praying mantis have actually learned to hang around hummingbird feeders and wait for the hummingbirds and feed on them that way. There's a lot of YouTube videos, especially from the western part of the United States, where they have figured that out. A very famous example of insects that have to worry about a bird is with shrikes. Shrikes are these wonderful little perching birds that act like birds of prey. They go out and about in the environment and feed on snakes, feed on lizards, and feed on birds. Their talons and bill aren't strong enough to rip the flesh from their prey item, so they find stickers like barbed wire fence or mesquites, and they impale their prey item on those spikes and then feed on them at their leisure. But there are really big predators, especially up north and out to the west, that are going to be really impactful for grasshopper populations in particular. Another cool bird that I thought I would mention that fed on insects, and of course we're seeing this theme over and over again. Hey, birds feed on insects. I'm sure you're getting bored with that, but I think there's some interesting stories here. One of those is with dippers. And dippers are going to be these beautiful little birds that live in fast flowing streams, and they exclusively eat these aquatic invertebrates, in particular these insects. And so they dive and they swim through the water in these fast moving streams to feed on these aquatic insects like mayflies and caddisflies and beetle larvae that are living in those areas. And of course, a lot of us are wanting purple martins around our area because of their ability to feed on insects. Although a lot of people are hoping that those purple martins will play a role in mosquito control, feeding on mosquitoes. But a number of studies have found that purple martins actually eat many, many more dragonflies than they do mosquitoes. And some of that data was also coming from one of Doug Talamay's students, Ashley, who came and talked to the group a few years ago. And she also found that a lot of the pictures that were turned in for the project What Do Birds Eat had purple martins not eating tiny insects, but these big dragonflies. And of course, those dragonflies are aerial predators that do themselves eat insects. So it's always not this clear-cut story that's being told between insects and birds. One story that we can also talk about is these plankton feeders, like whales of the ocean that are opening their mouth to filter out prey items. You have these goat suckers, nightjars and parakeets and whippoorwills and chuck-will's widows that fly through the nighttime skies with their mouths open, picking up beetles and moths and other flying insects, and being major predators that most of us don't have a chance to observe those behaviors, but of course are relying on insects for their survivorship. And some birds take it a step further and actually use some tool making when it comes to insects. And an example of this is with burrowing owls that feed on beetles. And they move dung from cows and other ungulates closer to their nest or in a centralized location. So as the beetles come in to feed on the dung from that animal, they can go out and forage on those beetles, not expending too much energy walking around and looking around across the plains that they live in or the open area they live in, but having a specific hunting ground or a trap, if you will, for those insects. And here's kind of a relationship between birds and some of these grassland animals, especially cows. But that relationship between birds isn't just found in other birds or mammals, it's also found with other insects. In particular, one example that some of you might have had the experience if you've traveled to the New World tropics is following this group of birds known as antbirds that change where they nest, the way that they nest, the time that they breed, to be able to keep track of army ants. And so army ants don't have a stable colony, they move. They have periods of time where they set up a bivouac, they're stable, they're not moving as much. But typically, especially when there's larvae about, they will switch their area and do raids where they run out in the forest and anything that can't get away from them, they subdue and divvy up, chop up, and bring back to the nest to feed the larvae, to feed their sisters. But these birds follow these army ants as they go out into the jungle ground looking for those prey items. And as things try to escape, these ant birds are picking up the fleeing creatures. And so on some level, their survivorship is relying on the army ants' job of going out and foraging and stealing the food from those army ants. And as I mentioned, here's a nice symbiotic relationship, but there's also a parasitic relationship. So that's a little louse. It's a bird louse. And this is a Hippobasket fly. If some of you hunt, sometimes when you hunt deer, you might find these flies. If some of you are familiar with livestock, these flies, sometimes called keds, are found on sheep. Oftentimes they don't have wings because they're ectoparasite living within the fur of a deer or a sheep. But some lice who also lack wings find these winged flies, hold on to them, and hitch a ride to a bird. And so they can drop off of the fly, now that it's gotten a free trip, and start to feed on the bird. And birds act as these little islands where the lice start to specialize, and you have very unique communities of life on very specific types of birds. And so you can look at the evolution of these ectoparasites, and as birds diversify, the parasites also diversify as well. You see that with the finches of the Galapagos, as well as the mockingbirds of the Galapagos, who are speciating because they're on different islands. And now the lice are speciating on each bird lineage like it's its own unique island. So this is a really interesting tale of the complexity that nature has unfolded before us. But sometimes those parasites, those ectoparasites, are really bad for bird populations. And here we have an example of a mosquito feeding on one of Hawaii's endemic species and spreading things like avian malaria that has highly impacted the survivorship of the birds on that island. And there's a lot of reasons why birds in Hawaii are having a rough time, but in part, it is the spread of avian malaria that's caused by mosquitoes, and something that a lot of us probably no doubtedly experienced if we lived along the East Coast a number of years ago was West Nile virus. That virus, when entering bird populations, in particular corvids, ravens and crows and blue jays, are really susceptible to that virus, and they end up dying when exposed to that virus. But that virus, of course, is being transmitted, being vectored by a mosquito. Now, insects aren't defenseless against all these creatures feeding on it. And like insects, driving the evolution of the birds, the way they look, the way they behave, the way they interact with the environment, birds have driven the evolution of insects as well. And one famous example of that is insects that have developed eye spots. And so birds don't like things looking back at them. So we have a number of caterpillars pictured here that have these false eye spots. None of these are the head, although this is the head. This is the head, but a lot of times it's the butt or the back where it just looks like an eye. Or this is the butt of a katydid and it lifts its wings up to expose an eye. This is underneath a blue morpho butterfly. We flipped it over, it'll be a beautiful blue, but they fold their wings up, and then if a bird scares them, they open it up, and those eyes looking back at you are enough to make the bird take pause and go, man, I'm not going to eat you. I'm going to avoid you and leave you alone. And in some cases, that evolution has been pushed so far to avoid avian predation that you have things like this silk moth caterpillar that looks like from underneath a snake head. So I think we all agree that does look like a snake's head, but in actuality, here's the head of the caterpillar, here's its legs, and it's kind of just poofed out the side of its body to make that shape. So the caterpillar is normally up and down, a bird flew by, it flips its head back, and now it looks like a snake. And I'll give you a side view of what that would look like. Again, here's the legs, here's the head, that's where the eye is. That's the eye here, but it's flipped over and is able to avoid being eaten by that bird. So we have this way of advertising, hey, leave me alone, don't eat me, bird. And we can see that with even some of our creatures found around your house, like the monarch or the viceroy butterflies, where the monarch keeps some nasty chemicals because it's feeding on milkweed. And the viceroy really doesn't keep those chemicals because it's not feeding on the same food resource. So instead of being the baddest in town, it just looks like the baddest, in this case, the monarch, to avoid bird predation, which is an example of something called Batesian mimicry. There's also where there's reinforcement mimicry, where everyone that tastes bad is visually communicating that, and that's known as mutilarian mimicry. But what I want you to notice is there's some distinct colors between both of these sets, yellows and blacks, oranges and black, reds and blacks, and patterns, which birds are really good at seeing in color, and of course, picking up patterns. We know this because of breeding plumage. So what's helping these insects look the way they do? It's avoiding avian predators, because mammals tend not to see in color. So it's the birds driving the evolution of these insects. And of course, insects aren't just simply driving the evolution of birds, and birds just aren't simply driving the evolution of insects, but insects are playing a really important role in changing the communities that a lot of our birds are going to inhabit. For example, out west, you have these pine beetles. Now, they are also here in Virginia, that many species occur. We are familiar with them if you've gone to Chincoteague, because a lot of the pine trees that are dead in Chincoteague are because of this pine beetle. But thankfully, unlike the West, we don't have this regime of having really hot, dry periods where then, because of lightning strikes, you have huge forest fires. So you can see this little beetle, it goes and attacks these weak trees, and then it lays its eggs, beetle populations grow, so they start to move out and affect nearby trees. And over time, you can have whole mountainsides that are devastated with just dead trees that are waiting for a lightning strike. And when a lightning strike comes through, it burns down the forest. And of course, no forest, no habitat, no birds. But a lot of birds are going to wait for the succession or the rebirth of that forest, and you can go and find a diversity of birds there. And I posted a story on Facebook to talk about that journey as a forest starts to come back and its positive impact on birds. And then a study that I read, I think last summer, was about how these pine beetles are going to increase pine tree damage and mortality. But what that does, what it cascades as, or what it leads to, is that less pine trees means less shade, more wildflowers, more insects, in particular pollinators. And of course, that cascades to impacting birds as well. So a lot of complexity that we can see in the world around us. But again, just starting with these little tiny things that maybe a lot of us have taken for granted. And sadly, taking them for granted because the world is experiencing these insect declines, sometimes called the insect apocalypse. And there's a number of different studies. And these studies sometimes are local, like the one I've cited here, looking at things in Germany, where there was a huge decrease in the number of flying insects. There were some other studies that looked across the globe, just not at one country, and they too found a huge decrease in insects. And with some modeling, some have predicted a 1% decline for insects per year, but with less insects, that means there's less food for birds. Less food for birds, that means there's less food for other birds, or birds that are playing a role in seed dispersal, birds that are playing a role in just making our lives happy. They're all interconnected together. And these insect declines, or this potential for this insect apocalypse, is really important to take note of. And there's a lot of different insects that are being impacted. There's a lot of reasons why those insects are impacted. We can talk more of that sometime, because I actually have a whole presentation that I've been given for the last few years about that. But on some level, all insects are being impacted for the same reasons, just like all bird populations are being impacted for the same reasons, which is habitat destruction or fragmentation, invasive species, human population growth, which puts more strain on the habitat, pollution, climate change, overexploitation. Some things like butterflies and tiger beetles get collected a good bit, so their populations are impacted. Birds, we know there's a huge pet trade for birds. And then, of course, disease, as we experienced here last summer. Now, a lot of us care about that, and I know a lot of us are familiar with Doug Talamay's books about you are responsible for this in the sense of saving the planet. Because yes, sure, we are all doing things to impact the planet, but because you have some land, or you can get some land, or you know someone who has some land, you have the ability to make a huge difference, because there's more land in the hands of private owners than there are in the public domain. And we can help by allowing insect populations to stabilize, to become complex. And through the complexity of insect populations, you bring in the birds, because it is really the little things that run the world. We might like to think about it being us. We might like to think about it being a bird. We might like to think about it being a deer, but it's really the insects that run the world. They're going to help create these relationships within these ecosystems. They're going to be a major component, as we talked about, as a food resource. They're going to help move nutrients in the soil so plants can grow big, strong, faster, and better. They do all these other interesting things, spreading diseases, controlling populations. And without the insects, without the spiders, without the mites, our ecosystems aren't healthy. They start to fall apart. So we need to welcome those insects into our area, welcome them into our garden, welcome them into our landscape, because those insects bring diversity, decomposition, predators, prey, and pollinators. So the last few things that I want to leave you with is, you as a gardener have the ability to change your landscape. If you're just living in your home, you have the ability to manipulate your landscape. If you're not an active gardener and doing all the wonderful things that a gardener is doing. Also, just as a person, who you vote for makes a big difference in the roles that people can play in changing their landscape. And that change should be a pro-insect change, because with more insects, we will have more birds. With more insects, we have more complexity. With more complexity, we have things like more flowers for hummingbirds. We have better success of fruiting plants or seed-producing plants that will bring in the plants, propagation of those plants, a higher population of those plants. More plants actually means, you know what? We have less ability to see our nosy neighbors, or maybe buffer some sound from that road that's nearby. Having these plants that promote the insects, insects that promote plants, insects and plants that promote birds are a very good thing. because a lot of our landscape, as we can see through this image, is highly fragmented. There's very few big green spaces left, but you have the ability to make a difference. And one thing that I want you to think about is insects are tiny. They don't need a lot of land to have an ecosystem. Just a patch of milkweed, just a patch of goldenrod is a whole complete safari in just a small plot in your land. And insects are very good at getting around. There was a study done in the 1930s that had this box or net that was open high in the sky. So as the plane flew, it picked up insects at different altitudes. And once you get up pretty high with insects, there's wind and you can get blown to distant landscapes. So if you build it, they will come. And we want to move from these homogeneous yards to these more naturalistic yards, because with insects, even if you hate them, you're going to have more birds. And if you're interested in some of these topics, there's a lot of books out there for you now. This is just a slide to show you some of those books that you can explore on your own. And some of them, such as Insects and Gardens by Grisel, is going to be a wonderful resource about some actual design elements that I did not mention. And of course, since we're in the fall, I'm going to beg you to leave the leaves. Do not mulch your leaves. Do not rake up your leaves. Let your leaves stay, because the silk moths in particular, like the Luna moth, fold leaves in on their chrysalis and fall to the ground with that leaf. So if you rake it up or you chop it up, you're getting rid of the nice Promethean moths and the wonderful Luna moths, not to mention all the nutrients that you're removing away. So let your leaves lie and then mulch them in the summertime after emergence. And I know I've gone a little bit late because we had a long meeting, but if there's any questions, I will be happy to talk through any of those now.
Fascinating, Sean. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Charm.
Thank you, Sean. That was really great.
You're welcome. So hopefully we've all learned some wonderful things. And if there isn't anything, I will bid you all a fair adieu until we see each other again.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Sean.
Congratulations on your promotion.
What, Gwen?
I said congratulations on your promotion.
Oh, thank you so very much. I appreciate it.
Serve it.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
And I
Goodbye,
have-
everyone.